Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you guys for having me. I skipped ahead there by accident. Yeah, it's good to be with you again. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm going to be talking to you tonight about my latest book, which is Birds of Florida. And I'm going to take you back a little bit first. And I actually got to Florida in the first place for graduate school. And as you can see by these pictures, I was studying herpetology at the time. So amphibians and reptiles. And I loved birds, but I didn't spend a whole lot of time specifically looking at birds. But right after I graduated, I started working for a small nonprofit called the Institute for Regional Conservation. And they were a plant-based organization. So I started learning about native plants through them. And I also became very excited just by their name. You can tell regional conservation. They were really interested in trying to get native plants spread throughout the urban corridor to help rewild the urban corridor. And this became an idea that I really became passionate about and drives a lot of what I do even today. So the Institute of Regional Conservation was really important to me, also learning the native plants. But also then it was through the Institute for Regional Conservation that I got connected to the Audubon Society when my boss asked if I would be willing to join the Tropical Audubon Society board, and I agreed to do so. So that was when I first started really paying attention to birds, and I very quickly realized that birds are a really good conservation tool and much better than snakes, for example. I can tell you that. Nobody wants a snake in their yard, but people are happy to have birds in their yard. So I started kind of going down this line of really learning my birds and learning about their ecology a little bit better. And really trying to focus on their role in native plants and getting that regreening the wildlife, regreening the urban corridor, sorry, through those native plantings. And so also through Tropical Audubon, I got connected with who and my now husband and author, co-author on many projects, James Cushland, who's an ornithologist. And we started collaborating on these books for South Florida. One is Attracting Birds to South Florida Gardens, which is all about how to garden for wildlife. And that other one is specifically about Fairchild Botanical Garden, which we have down here in the Miami area. But the book really is about the role that public gardens can play in bird conservation. So I really got into birding and birds through this conservation avenue. And also, what was important about these two books is I had decided I wanted to be a photographer at that point and was transitioning out of being a biologist, but I hadn't actually yet bought a camera. So I bought my first real camera, not just a point and shoot, for these two projects and kind of had to learn bird photography by fire because I was out there trying to take pictures of all these songbirds as they were eating insects and fruit. And anybody who's tried to photograph songbirds knows that they're not the easiest thing to learn on. And the other complication was I was still really learning my birds. And a lot of these were the confusing fall warblers. That's a lot of what we get down here in southeastern Florida. Our big migration period is during the fall. So I was learning a lot while I was working on these projects. But it was also a very exciting time because I didn't know even some of the more common birds, and so I'd come home all excited. I just found this gray bird that had a red bud, and it turns out a lot of times it was kind of a more common bird. I just hadn't known it before. So that was all very exciting and kind of got me into the birding world and in a different angle of conservation as well. Um, but the other thing it did, it was really the first time that I got connected with the birding community. It started with Tropical Audubon, of course, but through Tropical Audubon, I met this group of lovely ladies on a walk. And as we were talking at the back of the walk, we were like, we should start doing walks with other women and try and get women in nature, just get people out birding, people who maybe haven't thought about birds. But Miami doesn't have a huge environmental community, and we thought this might be a really good idea. And sometimes those ideas, they get tossed out there and then nothing happens. But we made a point of having another meeting later that week to really hash out what would it take to do this? What would we need? And it continues today. This was 2017 is when we had those meetings. And we're still thriving now. It's all volunteers. And so we've got Phoebe's Birding, which has become a really good community. And I've learned a lot about birding from these lovely ladies as well. But the reason I show you them also is because it is directly through this group that I got the Birds of Florida contract. And this book really wouldn't have existed without Phoebe's. During the pandemic, a editor from Bloomsbury out of the London office contacted us through Phoebe's through the email and said, I'm looking for somebody, essentially not old white male, to do a book in our Helm Wildlife Guide series on birds of Florida. And I was like, yes, I can do that. And when I first started talking to him, it sounded like a very doable project. He was talking about, what an average visitor could see in a couple weeks. And so I'd seen some other bird books that were, the kind of user-friendly, shorter books, maybe 100, 150 species. And I was thinking, oh, I probably already have all of those. Plus, at the time I was talking to him, I was working on my Wild Florida book, which means I was already traveling all over the state. I was hiking, I was camping, and I was doing photography. So I thought, this will be easy. I can just tack this on top of that and get two books out of all the same project. Turns out both of those things were not exactly accurate. First of all, it turns out he wanted 300 species of birds, which is considerably more work. But also the photos that I was trying to get for Wild Florida were much more artistic. And this would not be very helpful in a guidebook. And what you need in a guidebook is something like this. Bird is centered, which of course goes against all compositional advice. You want very close up. You want to focus on the characteristics that are the defining features. Things like, is there a wing bar? What color are the legs? What color is the rump? You want to make sure all of those details are visible, and you want to be really as close up on the bird as you can. So it was a totally different type of photography, and it ended up not being compatible with Wild Florida. So then I had to decide though, okay, so what are these 300 species of birds that I am going to include in this book? And fortunately, Florida has roughly 550 birds on its species list. So, there's a lot to choose from, but still I had to make some choices. And so some of those choices were easy. Like, of course, the Florida scrub jay, are only endemic species in the state. Of course, that one goes in. That's a no-brainer, right? And also some of these common, widespread, year-round residents, those were also obvious choices. Of course, I'm going to include those. And then I started to think about, during the process when I first started talking to the editor, he was saying, we're just going to market this in Europe and London. It's not going to be marketed in the US. But I think he didn't fully appreciate that Florida is actually a birding destination within the United States as well. And so I started throwing out there, well, people come here from other states. And he was like, oh, well, maybe we should also market it in the US then. And once that decision was made, I started really thinking even bigger about, okay, what are the specialty birds that we have and that would have gone in anyway, but I was really trying to think more specifically about what would be the things that would bring birders even from North America, specifically to Florida. So specialty species like the snail kite, but I also really wanted this to be thorough and very much a Florida book. I didn't want this to just be, cut and paste bird from somewhere else, but we find it in Florida. I wanted to really feature the things that make Florida special. And so I went to great effort to include even some of these hard to find subspecies that are endangered and so not easy to photograph, but I wanted to make sure they also were included in the book, like the Florida grasshopper sparrow and the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. And also thinking about, people from Europe, they probably are not going to come to Florida to see parrots and macaws. They would just go to South America, right? But people from other states would like to see those. So I made sure to include some of the non-native species that have established populations that I figured people would specifically be coming to Florida to have a look at. And then, of course, with over 300 species, I also wanted to include the migratory birds. Some of them, of course, are quite common. Some of them are quite rare, but they're all beautiful. They're all exciting. And I wanted to include as many of them as I possibly could, which, of course, meant I had very limited time periods to get those guys. And I also wanted to include, some of the rarer things that are more geographically restricted, like the Henslow sparrow is mostly in northern Florida, and it's actually quite rare. But I wanted to make sure I included those as well because it is a seasonal resident. And actually, this ended up being one of my favorite birds. I'd never seen one before, and it's just beautiful. It's almost like a warbler of the sparrow world. And then also some of the more common my visitors that come, and particularly from the Caribbean, knowing that we get a lot of them, and that too would have a broader appeal to people from other states coming to visit. And then, of course, 300 species is not just 300 photographs because you also need to include males and females where when they're different, so like the black-throated blue warbler here. And seasons, non-breeding versus breeding. One of the things that drives me crazy when I pick up a guidebook and they're showing you all the beautiful spring plumage, breeding plumage birds. And in fact, a lot of that is not what we see in Florida. So I tried to include both. But if a bird is normally or almost always in non-breeding plumage in Florida, that's what I put in the book because I really wanted this to reflect what we see in Florida. And of course, the biggest challenge was that even at the beginning of this conversation with the editor, I was like, I'm going to take all of these pictures. I'm going to do it myself. And if you pick up any other book in this series, there's at least a page of photo credits for all the people who have taken all the different photos in the book. And, even other books, that's pretty standard for an identification guide to have lots of photographers. But I really wanted to do it on my own. I had told myself early on that if I needed to, I would use other people's photographs. But the closer and closer I got to reaching my goal, the less inclined I was to do that. I became more and more adamant that nope, I'm going to get all of these photographs. And fortunately, my husband didn't tell me at the time. He waited until I'd already submitted all my materials. But he did finally tell me, you do realize photographing 310 species in a 2-year period for Florida, that was an impossible task. So fortunately, I didn't know that. So I was able to do it. Um, but it did get harder to get successes the more species I'd already gotten photographs of, right? So there were certainly some days, even early on, that were really frustrating, and I'd come home and be like, yeah, I didn't get anything. But by the end, when I had just a handful of species that I still needed, it became really, really challenging. And so each success became really, really exciting. So this is a Kentucky warbler that I had been warned was going to be a hard one to get. And it was my last spring migration before my book deadline. So I only had a couple months to get this all put together. And if I was going to have a Kentucky warbler, like this was my last chance. And so a friend of mine had come down to the Keys with me, and we had been birding Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West all morning. And we were kind of like, okay, I think we've got everything that's here. There's nothing more. None of my targets are here. Let's go. We literally had just gotten in the car. My friend started backing up, and then she hit the brake and was like, Kentucky warbler. And sure enough, this little guy had landed on a limb right in front of her car. And fortunately, I still have my camera on and in my lap, and I jumped out and got this picture before it flew away just moments later, frankly. And then a couple weeks later, I was on a Phoebe's birding walk, led by Patty Cunningham in the Evergreen Cemetery in Fort Lauderdale. And she was like, I can't believe this, but we just found a Swainson's warbler. And this, of course, was also on my very short list of birds left. And my ears perked. I was like, okay, that's it. I'm going to get this picture. But this bird was not cooperative at all. It spent most of its time deep in the bushes. And as soon as I would get an aim at it, it would fly away. So I ended up abandoning the walk entirely and spent a good 3 hours chasing this bird around, even taking a break during a major rainstorm to sit in my car until it passed, and then went back out. And finally, he sat long enough for me to get this picture. But I think, being a relatively new birder myself, and through my interactions with Phoebe's, where we have a lot of newbie birders all the time, I really was cognizant of how hard it can be for somebody who's never birded before to go out and start trying to figure out what the birds are. And so I really wanted to make sure that all my descriptions were using layman's terms and not technical terms that was really going to be intimidating and bogged down people who don't know what they're doing. So I was really cognizant of that fact as I was doing my descriptions. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of space. So I really had to, first of all, rely on the photographs, try to not repeat what was already there because there wasn't much space, and really focus on the things that mattered. This made me think really hard about what it was that makes this bird different than anything else. And also, I wanted to make sure, again, that our Florida subspecies were being represented. And so I sometimes would include a full page in order to get a different photo of our subspecies of the prairie warbler, for example. But thinking about things like, okay, a lot of times you see size. Oh, well, the great white heron is bigger than the great egret. But as you can see here, if they're standing by themselves out in the middle of habitat, that may not be the easiest feature to tell people. It might not be that helpful. And so trying to focus in on things like leg color instead as I'm doing my descriptions. We're thinking about habitat as well. The mangrove cuckoo is pretty exclusive to mangroves or mangrove affiliated plant communities, and not often found in other habitats, whereas the yellow-billed cuckoo can be found, it's a migrant, and so you can find it in nearly any habitat as it's coming through, forested habitat as it's coming through. And so habitat can help. And so that's some of the things I thought about as I was putting those descriptions together. And then also thinking about calls. These are both very stealthy birds that like to spend as much of their time as they can deep in the woods. And so you may not actually even see them. And so some of these things, thinking about the call as well and trying to describe the call. And in this case, the mangrove cuckoo has a very guttural, croaking kind of call, whereas the yellow-billed cuckoo has kind of a hooting cluck almost. So trying to figure out, really those factors as well. If nobody's going to see the bird, then they need to know what it's going to hear, what it's going to sound like. And of course, sometimes behavior is the answer. I spent quite a lot of time looking at this bird at St. Sebastian's Inlet, sorry. And I was like, what is that thing? I was a little bit stumped at it. And then the second it started fishing and doing its little pirouette dance across the water to do that, I was like, oh, I know exactly what that is. That's the white morph of the reddish egret. So again, sometimes behavior was the thing that I needed to include in the description to make it clear. And this is part of a series, so I didn't have a whole lot of control of all the pieces that are in there. But one of the features of this book that I really liked was the birding spots in Florida section. And again, I didn't have a whole lot of space, so I had to be picky. But one of my goals was to make sure that there was something for everywhere in the state. I wanted to make sure that no matter where you were in Florida, there was at least one birding location that was within range that I was including here. And the other thing I've become quite aware of lately and have been paying a lot of attention to is birding for the mobility challenged. And so I tried to, in each of the spots that I included, also include at least some comment like this boardwalk is wheelchair accessible, or as you can see here, beach wheelchairs can be rented from these locations. So trying to make sure that everybody's included, even in my descriptions of locations where people should go. And again, just like the birds, I had to make some decisions, some of them tougher than others. This was a very easy decision, right? Dry Tortugas National Park is world famous as a birding destination. And so that one, of course, has to go in. You get all kinds of migrants going through there, and you have all of these tropical breeding nesting colonies that are there that you can't find anywhere else in the continental United States. So this was one that really needed to go in. But I also wanted to include these more localized things, like you guys have like a Popka Wildlife Drive, which also happens to be one of the top eBird sites for Florida. So that one was also like, oh, of course I'm going to put this in because it's a really important one. It may not be world famous, but it is locally famous and for good reason.
Thank you.
You've done well there. And also wanted to, I did include Wakotahachie wetlands because it is a spectacular place, especially during breeding season. But I also, in the introduction, tried to talk about, in general, where would you find birds? And our water treatment facilities, these wetlands, water treatment wetlands, are really incredible resources. There's more and more of them around the state. You guys were just talking about the Orlando one. And they're wonderful because not only are they creating habitat where there wasn't any, and we're harnessing our natural habitat's ability to cleanse water, but this is also an opportunity for people to easily bird watch, get very close to nature, and get out and exercise on their own as well. So it's a win-win on all kinds of levels. And so, one of the things I mentioned in the book is anywhere you see one of these, go. It's going to be good. And then, of course, the benefit of us that live in Florida is that we can bird our own backyards. And I heard you guys talking about some amazing birds that you have in your yards up in that area. One that I was really pleased to get in my yard was this eastern kingbird. And it's landed in a lignum vitae tree that I had literally just planted a couple months before. And this was in a house that when I moved in looked like this. And I can tell you under those rocks was plastic to help keep the weeds out. And all those plants, the reason they look so nice is they're Home Depot specials. Nothing eats them, no insect likes them. And so they don't support the birds at all. And because I have that bird gardening book that I have to demonstrate, I literally went to the extreme of bringing in a bulldozer and taking everything out to start over. And this is what I created. And it's not all non-native, it's not all native plants. I like growing my own food too. So we have things like vegetable gardens and fruit trees and grapes. But like I said, just a few months after we planted that lignum vitae, we got the eastern kingbirds come in. The day that we filled that pond with water, we had a cloud of dragonflies in our yard. And we've gone from literally there was one catbird in the yard when we first moved in to we now have over 100 species of animals in general, not just birds, but we also have snakes and we've introduced the native turtles into our ponds. We have mammals and butterflies. And I mean, sometimes we have a cloud of butterflies actually in our yard. So a lot can be done in your yard. And if you create the space, the birds will come to you. And that is some of the easiest, best birding possible. And just as I'm ending, I just want to kind of reflect on the fact that wildlife in general, but birds in particular, the more I've gotten to know them and the more people I've met talking about birds, there's something about them that just really inspires people. And they connect people to the environment, but also to each other. So that's another picture of the phoebes. And they also can create new opportunities, new connections. And so had the opportunity, I was invited by the Miami Book Fair to interview Amy Tan this year, who just came out with a book about backyard birds and how inspirational they've been to her. And because I just had my bird book come out as well, I got the opportunity to take her birding and to interview her. And so birds can really connect and inspire and create opportunities that are completely unexpected. So continue birding, get out there, and continue connecting. Thank you all.
Very nice. Thank you. And are these all your books here?
Yes, these are all my books. And actually, Birds of Florida and Recovering Caribbean Nature just came out this fall. And if you go to the publisher's website, you can get 20% off using that code there for the Birds of Florida book.
Oh, nice. Birding 20.
I would be happy
Yeah.
to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah. Anybody have questions? You can put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and go live.
Here, I can stop sharing so that you can actually see one another too. Although I guess nobody has their camera on.
So what was your favorite bird that you photographed?
I mean, that's hard because, like the Sperosea spoonbills are just so amazing, right? But I really did become quite fascinated with the Henslow sparrow because I tend to think of sparrows as being, relatively dull. And this thing was just spectacularly beautiful. So I do think that one ended up being an unexpected favorite.
Very nice. And Jeannie wants to know what kind of photo equipment do you use?
So I actually upgraded my equipment when I started working on this book. Before I had, a regular Canon, not mirrorless system. But for this book, I really needed to get up close to the birds. And I'm not a tripod person. I started off as a biologist, sneaking through the bushes, and so tripods don't really work with my style of getting close to animals. So I switched to mirrorless, the Canon R6, in order to handhold an 800 millimeter lens. And so that's what I'm using now. And when I was working on this project, I will tell you, well, I started doing this before, but particularly with this project, it was important to have the 800 millimeter on one side, but a second camera body with the 100 to 500. And that way, if a bird suddenly popped up and it was right next to me, I could still get the photograph. I didn't have to lose it.
Very good. Saul wanted to know, do you get the LeConte sparrow in Florida? And if so, where and when can you find it?
So Lacan's was one that I did not get. I mention it in the book, but it's the rarest of the sparrows. It does get into the panhandle, and sometimes in St. Mark's in particular is a good place. In fact, St. Mark's is where I got a lot of my sparrows, St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge. Um, and the best place actually turned out, and I'm of course going to space on the name of it right now, but it's not the main drive where you go down to the lighthouse. If you go down to one of the tracks a little further west, there's one that's wetlands, grassy wetlands, and that is just full of sparrows. That's where I got most of my sparrow pictures. And I do have Nelson's, and yeah, I'm spacing on the name right now, but LeConte's is one that I did not end up getting, but it does occur there occasionally. It's the most rare of the ones.
Nice. So is there any bird that you did, other than the LeContes, is there any other bird that you didn't get that you were really hoping to get?
Well, actually, my nemesis bird is one that the night I met you, or at least the night I met Kathy, I was trying to get the American woodcock. And I did hear it with you guys that night. And we saw a shadow, but I didn't get any photos. And I had fail after fail after fail on the American woodcock. So American woodcock did not end up getting into the book.
I will have to say, I've only seen them like where you could actually see the bird in Ohio. I've never, I mean,
Yeah,
I
well,
see
and the
outlines,
more
I
I
see shapes, I hear them here, but
Yeah, the more I talked to people and the more I researched it, I mean, they do occur in Florida and they can be here pretty consistently.
mhm.
However, they are normally seen. I mean, they're not normally seen. They're normally heard, or you just see the shadow at night. It's not the same as you're suggesting up north, where they're just during season they're like out and you can see them pretty easily. But that doesn't really happen in Florida. So when I finally figured all that out and I'd failed to get pictures anyway, I was like, all right, well, you don't deserve to be in the book anyway.
How about
So
flamingo?
someone want to know how many species of owls are there in Florida?
Ooh, off the top of my head. Okay. I'm not good at keeping numbers in my head. So let's just go through them. There's the screech owl, the
Mhm.
great horned owl, the wow, I'm not good at doing this kind of thing on the top.
Barred owl over my
Barred
shoulder.
owl,
Yeah, the barred owl. Yeah,
burrowing owl.
the short-eared owl is one that comes that I didn't get in the book. It's more of a visitor. It doesn't get here quite so commonly. Let me just flip through quickly and see these on the spot questions I'm apparently not so good on. Hang on. Um, I think it's four or
I
five.
I think you got them.
Did I get them all? I was like, I feel like
Yeah, the burrowing owl,
oh,
barred
burrowing
owl,
owl. Yes, thank you.
barn.
That's
Oh,
the one.
barn owl. Yeah, barn
Barn
owl.
owl, burrowing owl, screech owl, barred owl, great horned owl.
Great horned owl.
Yeah. But I didn't include the short-eared owl, which we get down here anyway. We get the Caribbean one comes up sometimes
Oh,
um,
nice.
as a visitor.
How about flamingos?
Well, I did get flamingos actually. They're in there. And yeah, I mean, flamingos are increasingly coming back. So I felt very strongly that that was one that needed to come to be in the book because there's enough observations of them, and the trend seems to be that they are going to be returning and will be increasingly common as well.
Where
Very good. And so wanted to know about long-eared owls.
I'm not familiar with that one. I
I
don't.
think they're very uncommon. I think in the past, a few years ago, I think there was report of one. I didn't see it, but
Yeah, I mean I know they
uh,
exist and I
yeah.
know they're I think in Florida they're really really rare.
I think you probably have a better chance of seeing a snowy owl, but that's not saying much. I
Yeah.
have heard rumors of those too up on the beach, but not
Yeah.
when
No,
I've
well, there
visited.
was a couple years ago there was one hanging out in the Carolinas somewhere quite consistently on the beach dunes, which I was kind of like, you could come to Florida. We've got beaches.
Mhm. Oh, he said they have four long-eared owls in Central Park 4 days ago
Oh, in New York. Okay.
in New
That makes
York.
more sense.
You know, it's funny. I don't know, but my sister has seen them too, and it seems like you don't see one, you see like a bush full of them.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's what they do or what, but
Actually, somebody advised me, if you really want a woodcock, you should go to Central Park because they show up there in the spring and would be easy to photograph. And I was like, okay, that's
that's
unexpected.
and so will be our birding guide in Central Park. Oh, look at
Oh, Bryant Park. Yes,
Bryant
that's
Park,
right. Bryant
42nd
Park is
Street.
the one they were telling me. They said it was near Central Park. Yes, Bryant Park. Thank you. Thank you.
That's good. That's funny. So, any other good stories of experiences while you were doing the book?
Well, I mean, actually, I didn't know that there was a vermilion flycatcher in St. Mark's when I was there, and I just saw this flash of red go across the street, and I was like, "What is that?" And I went back and found it, and then I became determined to find a female. And it was actually that same visit when I was trying to figure out the woodcock. You guys told me, "Oh, there's some females that have been hanging around," and so I went to Lake Apopka in the restoration area, and I was walking around not seeing anything, not seeing anything, not seeing anything. And I was like, huh, I think they must have left or something. So I went up to the tower to sit down and have a rest. And I looked out and one landed on the line across the canal. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to go down and get this picture. I was tired. I'd been hiking for a long time, but I was like, no, 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 it's right there. I got to do this. So I went down thinking I was going to have to figure out how to get back around the canal to actually get a good picture. But by the time I got downstairs, it was waiting for me, literally like in a bush right there, right beside the tower. So yeah, it was actually I
Perfect.
wrote a blog about it because somebody asked me like how do you keep going on this? Like this is so crazy. Like you have so many failures. What keeps you going? And I was like, well, I don't know. The successes are really great. And she was like, oh, so it's like gambling. You're gambling. And I was like, wow, okay. I mean, I don't think of myself as a gambler, but I suppose you're right. Yeah, because it is those, you need to have those successes now and then to keep going. So I wrote a blog actually that includes that bird, and I called it the highs and lows of bird photography.
Burden. Wait, was that the high? That was the high, right?
Yeah, that was a high. It just showed up, and when I needed it, it came even closer. Yeah,
Mhm.
so it was good.
Wonderful.
But
Yeah,
you
it's so
try to focus on those and not, another one that kept escaping me actually was the American pipit. And like literally I would see on eBird, oh, it's at a park 5 miles from here. It's just been reported. I'm going. And by the time I get there, gone, not there. And that
Mhm.
continually happens as well. So it's much nicer to think about the successes than the ones that kept getting
Yeah.
away.
They're pretty hard to see too. They're pretty skulkers, so you
Yeah.
might, yeah,
Yeah.
hard to get, but nice. So any, so I want to know, is spring the best time to visit Florida? What do you think, Kristen?
I mean, spring migration is a great time because you've got stuff all over. The t general trend in Florida is that the fall migrants are coming down the East Coast and the spring migrants are going up the West Coast. And so things like, oh my gosh, why am I spacing on these things? The Fort DeSoto Park is a really good spring hotspot, whereas on my side of the state, Key Biscayne, Bill Bag State Park is a really good fall migrant hotspot. But spring, the birds certainly are more beautiful and spectacular, and they're all over during spring migration. But in fact, we have a lot of stuff here that overwinters as well. And I think part of what's really special about Florida and why we have such a long bird list is that we have different birds in different areas, right? So the Panhandle has some of these temperate things that don't get further south. Southeastern Florida and the Keys have a lot of tropical things that don't get further north. And a lot of those are, some of them even come in the summer to breed, right? So swallowtail kites, for example, start showing up in February. Spring is great because you're going to catch some of those as well. But really all winter is good. And there's just different stuff in the summer. It's just not as fun to be out there in the summer. It's hot.
Yeah, sometimes some of the things you can see better in the summer, but it is hot, like the kites and that's
Yeah,
it just isn't
trade-off.
it's pretty hot. You got to limit your birding time to morning, so
Yeah, for sure.
or evening. So any other questions? And Emily did want to say she enjoyed your work very much. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And Delcy thinks your books are great for beginners. They're a great tool.
Thank you. I worked very hard to make that the case. I wanted it to be something that people who had been birding a long time could use as well, but I definitely was putting an effort into making sure that people who are new to birding, because there's often not books for them that are designed for them. So that was very important to me. So I'm glad to hear that.
Now they didn't make you type the words in British like color with the OU, did they? No.
Well, I actually asked them, "Do you need me to do that?" And they were like, "No, it's okay. We'll just leave it that way." But what was interesting is that initially they wanted all the measurements in metric system. And I was like, okay, so I did that, and then I sent it out to review to some of my favorite Florida birders, and it came back with, "Why are you giving all the measurements in metric system? That's really stupid. Why did you do that?" And I was like, well, that's what's the series request, but let me see. That's a good point. Let me ask. And so they did allow me then to include inches as well. So now it's got both, whereas originally it was just metric.
That's fun, but that's good. That way you both the Brits and
Yeah.
anybody here, it's a good book for all. So,
Well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for the assistance you gave me on the project. Actually, you guys were key moments there, gave me some really good advice. So I
That's
appreciate
good.
that.
Remember
all right,
that.
we're just glad you got that Vermilion flycatcher, the female.
Yeah. So come on our survey. We still are looking for woodcock. Sometimes we get to see them, fly really fast. So that's about it.
But we did hear them that night. I was like, well, that's the
Yeah.
closest I've come so far.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
Yeah. They
but
quite a,
it's continued to bother me. So it probably won't be in Florida, but one of these days I am gonna get a woodcock
well,
picture.
you will.
Yeah. And
Mm.
Cindy said she can't wait to get your books. So
Yeah.
very
Use that
good.
discount code.
Yeah, don't forget the discount code.
Yes, that's right.
All right.
All right, very good.
Thank you,
So
Kirsten.
Yes,
thank you
thank
so much.
you.
Thank
And
you.
we'll
Good
have bird
night.
chat next week. See you
Yep.
then.